Today on Better Book Clubs, Louisa May Alcott's classic novel, Little Women. I've always said that Little Women is one of my favorite novels, and I'm doing this as part of my top 10 favorite novels series. But I hadn't read the book in a really long time. So when my daughter told me recently that she wanted to read it, I thought this is a great time. I'm going to read it with her. It occurred to me as she told me that she was enjoying it, how much lasting power this novel has had across so many generations. The novel was written and published as a book for girls in 1868. And Louisa May Alcott really just wrote it because she needed some money for her family. So she didn't expect it to be anything special. That's kind of the question that I approached it with as I sat down 150 years later to read this novel with my daughter. I thought, what is it about this novel that's so special, that has such lasting power? So today I want to share with you 5 things I think that have made Little Women such a perennial favorite. The first thing that I think readers throughout the generations have really loved about Little Women is that it's a book about a bunch of boisterous girls. And those characters are surprisingly hard to find, or at least they used to be, in literature. First of all, the protagonists of most of the books that I grew up reading were boys. And so even to have a book about girls in the first place was kind of a big deal when I was growing up. But also the fact that those girls then were really kind of outgoing and rough and tumble and would try anything. When I watched Greta Gerwig's new movie, Little Women, I thought maybe she had exaggerated the book because the opening scene in particular is just so loud and so kind of 21st century in a way in the behavior of the girls that I thought, oh, I don't remember the book being quite that outgoing. But then I read it and it was. So I think just those strong female characters are a real compelling element of the novel that keeps working generation after generation. Another thing that kind of surprised me as I reread the book was how funny it is. So there's just a lot of comedy, especially in the first half of the book, because it was published in 2 separate books. The first one is more about the childhood of the 4 sisters. They're teenagers, and in the second book, they're adults and having families of their own. I think that I was surprised by how funny so many of the incidents were. Little things like Amy using a clothespin to try and get her nose to turn up, and all of her malapropisms, and the physical comedy of Jo, and the melodramas that they perform together, and just so many little incidents that like, you know, burning their hair as they're trying to curl it to make it fancy for a ball that they want to go to. Just so many funny little stories along the way that make the book really fun to read. A criticism that Little Women sometimes receives is that it's a sentimental book, but I actually didn't find it to be sentimental at all. In fact, I found it to be very forthright in some ways about emotions, and women's emotions in particular, and how they're told to keep them under control, because Jo has a lot of trouble keeping her emotions in check. So just as an example of something that I thought had the opportunity to be sentimentalized but wasn't, is the story of Meg's engagement to John Brooke. When Jo realizes what's happening, she doesn't sugarcoat the story. She doesn't get excited for her sister. There's not a whole lot about wedding plans. Instead, she gets angry and upset that her sister is going to be leaving the family forever and things will be forever changed. That's kind of an unusual thing to talk about in a novel, and yet it's a very real life experience. Louisa May Alcott is willing to tell the truth about emotions, and I think that's what prevents this otherwise pretty sweet story from becoming saccharine. The fourth thing that I think has made this story last is the quality of the storytelling. There are lots of little compact stories built into the larger story. And when I went back to reread it recently, I expected it to read as an episodic novel where there were all these little self-contained stories that didn't really add up to anything. And it's true that there are lots of little self-contained stories. Alcott is a really good storyteller. And so, for example, spoiler alert, the story where Amy gets jealous, burns Joe's manuscript, and then Joe goes out skating one day and Amy is trying to make it up to her. She feels very badly about what she's done and Joe is angry with her, so she takes off without her and Amy falls through the ice and Joe has to come and rescue her. That whole playing out of that emotional story in which one of them gets angry, does something wrong, then the other one is angry, does something wrong, and the forgiveness has to be kind of brought together from both sides. That's a complete package of a story in itself. It could be told as a standalone story and be very satisfying. But it's part of many stories like that within the novel. And the thing that surprised me as I reread it was that the storytelling is so beautifully woven together that you can actually see a through line. And that was what I really didn't expect. But Alcott sets up things earlier that pay off later in the book. And so it's actually a very finely crafted novel. I think one more thing that really makes this novel last is that every girl can find herself somewhere in this story. I'm a big sister. I kind of saw myself in Meg. I empathized with her desire to have a family. I kind of get her practical side. She likes having nice things, but she can do perfectly well without them. I also empathize with some of the characteristics of the other characters, like Joe's impetuousness and her stubbornness, and Amy's stubbornness too, and her real hanging on to dreams. And I really admire qualities in all of them that I don't have myself so much, like Beth's complete compassion for others and constant giving to others. So I think there's something for everyone in every one of these characters. I was also really surprised to see the intimations of gender identity that Joe is struggling with. She comes right out a number of times and says, I really should be a boy. I feel like a boy. There was one particular scene that I found really touching and also funny when they go on a little picnic with some friends, and Lori and Joe are such close friends, and Lori really understands this part of Joe that she really feels like she's not a girl. And she doesn't want to be treated like a girl. And so just a little passing reference where they're climbing into the rowboat and Lori says something to Joe like, oh, come now, my good fellow. And the other people on the picnic kind of are taken aback by him calling her my good fellow. But it's just such a touching moment of friendship between them where he's really acknowledging her for exactly who she is. There were a number of other things that surprised me that I hadn't remembered from my long ago reading of the novel. And one of them was that The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan forms a thread through the whole first book of Little Women. I had not really caught on to that before, even though it seems fairly self-evident. And so that was kind of an interesting through line. I noticed how Alcott kept dipping back into The Pilgrim's Progress with metaphors and allusions to the book all the way through that first half of Little Women. And also the Christian morality in the book, which at the time would have been very expected, but today seems somewhat understated in a way that gives the book a central morality without making it unreadable to readers who are not Christian or not practicing in any faith. In the same way, temperance plays a role in the novel. So at the time, the temperance movement would have been really closely intertwined with the abolition movement, both of which the Alcott family were involved in. And there's a whole discussion about how Laurie really shouldn't be drinking at all. And that's a little bit challenging for him as a young man. And I was surprised to see that in there. I hadn't remembered that from before, but it happens with a light touch. And so I think some readers who might find that prudish can just pass right over it, and others who might actually find it something that they can identify with will also find it a connection that they can make as they're reading the novel. My daughter was reading the copy that we had at home, and so when I went to the library to ask for Little Women, I ended up with this gigantic copy, which at first kind of put me off, but it's an annotated edition, and so I really enjoyed reading it because it's full of historical information, illustrations, photographs, lots of little tidbits, and I want to share a couple of those fun things that came up in the annotations with you as well. So just as an example, there's a scene in the second half of the book where Meg is making currant jam, and she is really slaving over this kitchen all day trying to get this jam, and it's not working properly, and she's exhausted by the end of the day. And she's told her husband John that he's welcome to bring anyone home with him for dinner at any time, and she, as the perfect new young wife, will make sure that dinner is ready. And of course, this is the day that John chooses to bring a guest home for dinner with fairly disastrous consequences. I learned from the annotations that this was actually a true story, something that happened to Louisa May Alcott's older sister Anna, and the only difference is that she was canning tomatoes that day and not making currant jam. Another incident in the book involves Jo cutting her hair in order to come up with some money for the family. Again, that story was based on a true event. Apparently, Louisa May Alcott thought about cutting her beautiful long hair when she was 16 for the same exact reason, that she needed some money, and then a family friend came through and kind of saved the day, and she didn't have to cut her hair at that time. But later on, when she was in Washington, D.C. to help the Union soldiers during the Civil War, she became very ill, and she did cut off all of her hair. So she had that experience of having lost what she called her one great beauty. It's just that she sort of combined those two elements of reality into the story in Little Women. Another interesting note is that Louisa May Alcott was quite close to her father, Bronson Alcott. And in the novel, the March sisters are supposedly very close to their father as well. He's away fighting in the war in the beginning, and then his homecoming is a big deal for the whole family. But the character of Mr. March turns out to kind of fade into the background after that. And even though he's home from the war, we hardly hear a word from him. In real life, Louisa May Alcott's relationship with her father was much closer and deeper and much more intertwined. And I'll just leave you with a recommendation for a biography that I really enjoyed. That's actually a joint biography of both Louisa May Alcott and her father Bronson. It's called Eden's Outcasts, and it's written by John Madison. And it's one of the only dual biographies I think I've ever read. It does an interesting job of intertwining their lives and their relationship with one another. And it's just one of the many excellent biographies out there that are available about Louisa May Alcott. It was really fun for me to reread this classic novel that I had enjoyed first when I was a teenager, and to confirm that it still belongs on my top 10 list. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.